Professor Emeritus James Banks is Gary and Linda Indo Chair in Diversity Studies Emeritus at the University of Washington. He was the Russell Stark University Professor at the University of Washington from 2000 to 2006 and founding director for the Center for Multicultural Education from 1992 to 2018, which was renamed the Banks Center for Educational Justice. Banks was a Spencer Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University during the 2005 to 2006 academic year. Banks is a specialist in social studies education and multicultural education and has written or edited more than 20 books and 100 articles in these fields. His books include An Introduction to Multicultural Education and Diversity. Professor Emeritus James Banks will talk today about global migration, field citizenship, and the quest for social justice. Professor James Banks.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning. In Black culture, we call in response. If I say good morning, you shout back, good morning. Give you a lesson in Black culture from the United States. Cherry A. McGee Banks and I are absolutely delighted to be at the Air Academic College of Education. We are delighted. And we are also delighted that this is our 4th trip to Israel. I thought that was important for you to know. When we took that long plane ride, which we had a disconnect, but that's another story I'll tell you about. We spent the night, 2 nights ago in San Francisco Airport, waiting for another flight. But anyway, as we took the 15-hour flight from San Francisco, we knew how long it would be, but we wanted to come. We have found wonderful friends in this community and in this country. I said to friends, I'm going to Israel, and it's a beautiful country, but they have problems just like we have. That we have them in the United States, and that our goal is to help the good people in Israel deal with the problems of social justice. That's why we're making that 15-hour trip, to give our witness to social justice. So we are pleased to be here. This is our 4th trip. I wanted to just let you know what the others were. In 1997, we came to speak at the Hebrew University of Israel. That was our first trip. Our second trip was in 2015, and we spoke at the Garden College of Education. The third trip was 2019. We spoke at the Moffett Institute College. And of course, this is our 4th trip, crowned by the wonderful visit to the Arab Academic College of Education. We are very pleased to be here, to be the guests at this wonderful college, and to be the guests of a college that's struggling the way Black folks have struggled. There's a great identity with you, because we know what a struggle is about, as we've struggled in the United States. So we identify with your struggle, because it's similar to our struggle. The title of my speech, I wanted to do a special thank you to the staff of the Academic College who've been so wonderful. Dr. Rem Abu Maj drove all the way to Tel Aviv to pick us up from the airport. We are deeply grateful. We're also deeply grateful to Haya Kawade, who made our travel arrangements, and we are very grateful. And I sent her an email telling we had missed our flight. She answered in 5 minutes. I said to Cherry, she never sleeps. She was very efficient, which we really appreciate. Let's give her a hand. The title of my talk today is Global Migration, Failed Citizenship, and the Quest for Social Justice. Global migration and the quest by diverse racial, ethnic, cultural, linguistics, and religious groups for recognition, civic equality, and structural inclusion within their nation states have complicated the attainment of citizenship in nations around the world. Palestinian folks, black folks, Asian folks, Mexican American folks are struggling for citizenship. All over the world, the Muslims in France are struggling for citizenship. The African Caribbeans in London are struggling for citizenship. The Muslim groups in China are struggling for citizenship. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And in a number of nations, including the United States, Canada, England, and France, there's a push for xenophobic nationalism. And this push for xenophobia nationalism, we've seen it all over the world. In the United States with the election of Donald Trump. In Canada with the Brexit movement. We see the struggle for what's called social cohesion, which is a new form of nationalism. We see this form of nationalism, I call it xenophobic nationalism. We saw it in the French election, when Le Pen received 41% of the vote. Think about it. Macron won the election, but 41% of the French voted for a woman who's anti-immigrant, who's a friend of Putin, by the way. 41% of the French voted for Le Pen. All of us were on pins hoping she'd lose, but we were nervous all over the world about an anti-immigrant person who could win the French election. Thank God she didn't win, but I think we have to really be concerned that she got 41% of the vote. That should concern us all. The xenophobia that has targeted immigrant and indigenous groups have mobilized angry populist groups in a number of Western nations. They are, again, as I said before, were among the factors that led to the Brexit referendum in the UK, to the election of Donald Trump in the US. These developments and events have stimulated renewed, contentious, and polarized political discussion and debates about the extent to which Western nations can and should structurally integrate diverse groups into their nation state. This includes indigenous groups, such as Palestinians, indigenous groups, such as black folks, indigenous groups, such as Mexican Americans in the United States, as well as in migrant groups. So it's not just migrant groups, but many of these groups are like us, black folks, who've been at the U.S. since 1619. So it's both immigrant groups and indigenous groups. The xenophobia and institutionalized racism have caused many minoritized racial, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and religious individuals and groups to experience what I call structural exclusion and limited citizenship rights. I argue in this lecture that these groups and individuals experience what I'm calling failed citizenship. And consequently, they develop weak identities and ambivalent attachments to the nation state. If you're a black American and you don't see yourself reflected in the nation state, your attitudes toward the nation state are mixed, aren't they? You need to see yourself in the national culture to fully endorse it. You're going to be ambivalent if you don't see your visions, your hopes, and your dreams in the nation state. How can you fully endorse it? You can't. You got to see yourself, see your struggles, your dreams, your visions in the nation state before you can fully endorse it. By failed citizenship, by the way, I'm not suggesting that the citizens who are structurally excluded, alienated, and marginalized have failed. I want to make that clear. My students really pushed me on that. They said, Dr. Banks, you got to make sure that your audience understand that you're not criticizing the folks who are victims of failed citizenship, but rather I'm using failed citizenship to describe the characteristics of nation states rather than the characteristics of excluded and marginalized individuals and groups who are excluded from full participation in civic recognition. I'm going to present in this lecture a typology that's called failed citizenship. And it is a Fabian type typology, which means that the categories are interconnected, and you'll see that in a slide in a few minutes. Could I have a bottle of water? The categories are contextual, complex, and interactive, and they are not exclusive. In other words, they're interactive, flexible, fluid, and interrelated. And you'll see that, I believe it's the next slide. Yeah, this slide shows how failed citizenship, recognized citizenship. Can you see the slides okay? The light, could we dim the light a little over the slide? That's what I was thinking, that the light was a bit... Is that better? Yeah. So you see that these are interactive and interrelated. So that failed citizenship, recognized citizenship, and participatory citizenship can be, one can lead to the other. And they can interact, and also they can lead, when they transform, they can change, they can lead to transformative citizenship. Thank you very much. What is failed citizenship? Failed citizenship exists when individuals or groups who are born within a nation or migrate to it and live within it for an extended period of time, because of the discrimination and marginalization that they experience, do not internalize the values and ethos of the nation state because they don't feel a part of it. They feel structurally excluded within the nation state, and they have highly ambivalent feelings toward it. Individuals who experience failed citizenship focus primarily on their own needs for political efficacy, group identity, and structural inclusion, rather than on the overarching and shared goals of the mainstream nation state. Their allegiance and commitment to the nation state are eclectic and complex because they don't feel a part of it. They feel excluded. They feel marginalized. They don't feel recognized. What is recognized citizenship? Recognized citizenship exists when the state or nation publicly recognize an individual or group as legitimate, legal, and valued members of the nation state and provide the individual or group with full rights and opportunities to participate. Although recognized citizenship status gives individuals and groups the right and opportunity to fully participate in the civic community of the nation state, it does not guarantee their participation. Individuals who have state-recognized citizenship status participate in the state at very different levels, including non-participation. For example, estimates indicate that only 58% of eligible voters in the U.S. participated in the presidential election of November 2016 that resulted in the election of Donald Trump. That's very interesting. Suppose, what may have happened if 65% of Americans had participated? Just think about that. It's kind of a chilling thought, isn't it? The attainment of recognized citizenship status, again, gives individuals the right and opportunity to fully participate. However, it does not guarantee their participation. Consequently, individuals who have state-recognized citizenship status participate in the polity of the state at very different levels. And so the slide goes on to explain that some individuals who have full status participate at very different levels. Some I call minimal citizens, who simply vote in local and national elections for conventional candidates. Others, individuals who recognize citizenship, are what I call active citizens. They take action beyond voting to actualize existing laws and conventions. What about participatory citizenship? Participatory citizenship is exercised by individuals and groups who have been granted recognized citizenship by the nation state. It takes place when individuals with citizenship rights take actions as minimal as voting to influence political decisions. An example of participatory citizenship is the action taken by civil rights groups to enable African Americans to vote after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965. Participatory citizenship can, of course, only be exercised by individuals and groups who have been granted citizenship rights and recognition by the nation state. Participatory citizenship takes place when individuals with citizenship rights take action to influence political issues in their communities, the nation, and the world. What about transformative citizenship? Transformative citizenship action takes place to implement values and norms which are beyond state laws, and I'll give some examples. These people act according to social justice values, humane values, which may break the laws. There are some laws in countries like in Israel and the United States and Canada, there are laws on the books that are not consistent. There are fewer now, but historically there have been laws in these nations that contradicted human rights. For example, and I'll give some example. I'll give one example in particular. We should also help students with transformative citizenship. Also promotes what Nussbaum and Appia call cosmopolitan values. These are values beyond the nation state. They are humane and social justice values. They've been implemented by people such as Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King in the United States, and Rosa Parks, these people took action that violated national laws, but they helped to actualize values such as human rights, social justice, and to eliminate racism and discrimination. And because I have many young people in the audience today, young is anything younger than me. We have a lot of young people in the audience. I want to give the example of Rosa Parks in the Civil Rights Movement. But it occurred to me as I was going over my speech last night, by the way, if you've taken a 15-hour flight, you still have to go over your speech the night before. You get it. Because I have a rule, always go over it the night before. So you get in after 15-hour flying, and you go over your speech again. But as I was going over my speech last night, it occurred to me I wanted to give the example of Rosa Parks, but I said I just can't tell the example. The young people in the audience won't have a clue what I'm talking about. So let me talk about the Civil Rights Movement in the United States just a bit. One of the major sites of the Civil Rights Movement was Montgomery, Alabama, where there was a bus boycott. And that meant not riding the buses because they wouldn't. Black folks had to sit at the back of the bus. The Palestinians can probably identify with black folks sitting at the back of the bus, can't you? Say yes if you can. Yeah, you can identify with black folk sitting at the back of the bus. But one day Rosa Parks, and this was a pivotal moment in the Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks said, I'm not going to the back of that bus. Now you'll probably identify with it. I'm tired of going to the back of the bus. She said, Rosa Parks, and this was a moment that triggered the Montgomery's boycott of the buses by black folks. Rosa Parks she said, and this is a quote, people say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. She said, I was not tired physically. I'm no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. The only tired I was tired of giving in. What a stance. I was not tired physically. The only tired I was tired of giving in. And Rosa Parks didn't give in, and the boycott took place and succeeded. So these are people, transformative citizens, who take a stand that's beyond laws. Gandhi in India took a stand against the law. He took a human rights position. A stand. Rosa Parks took a stand. Martin Luther King took a stand against racist laws, but consistent with social justice and human rights. That's what we have to teach our kids, and I'm getting ahead of myself here. We have to teach our kids to know, to care, and to act. And I'm coming to that slide later. But I think we got to teach them that we get tired of being tired. She said, I'm tired of giving in. We have to teach our kids to get tired of giving in, to take action, to change society, and not just go along to be nice. Go along and be nice and to get along. That doesn't bring about the change. So remember the Rosa Parks, the Martin Luther King example. And in my closing, I'll come back to King. I want to just talk about failed citizenship around the world. Failed citizenship can be observed in nations around the world, including the Kurds in Turkey, the Muslims in France, and the Chechens in Russia. However, failed citizenship, as the next slide will show, or one of the next slides, is a fluid and complex concept and not an absolute concept. In other words, some groups experience failed citizenship at greater levels than others. For example, this chart shows you that if you look at failed citizenship and participatory citizenship, it is a continuum. It's not either or. Note that in failed citizenship, the structural inclusion of the group is weak. Their national identity is weak. Their national allegiance is weak. Their recognition in the nation is weak. And their civic participation is weak. But if you look over at participatory citizenship, those variables are strong. In other words, it's a sliding scale kind of concept with different levels of implementation. The Chechens in Russia is an example of a very high level of failed citizenship, because the Chechens are seeking separation from Russia in a separate nation. The situation of African Americans in the United States is multifaceted, intricate, and is significantly influenced by social class. As Wilson points out in his book, The Declining Significance of Race. In other words, the richer you are as a black man in America, or a black person in America, the less racism you have to deal with. The more you can stay at the high floor and the higher and be black. You don't have to experience much as the poor black who's staying in the Holiday Inn. So class and race intersects. But no matter how rich you are as a black person in America, you're still a victim of racism. No matter how high you get, you can experience racism. And if I had time, I could share some personal examples. But I must move on because I want to finish in time. Hopefully we'll have time for a question or two. So I'll move on. This just kind of repeats what I said. Black folks, to some extent, have really experienced less failed citizenship, but they do, no matter what their social class is. What about failed citizenship in France? The experience of Muslimist France is an important and complicated example of failed citizenship. Since the 1960s and the 1970s, the French have dealt with immigrant groups in ways distinct from the US, Canada, and Australia. La laïcité is a highly influential concept in France, the aim of which is to keep church and state separate. And that goes back to the dominance of the Catholic Church in France. La laïcité emerged in response to the hegemony of the Catholic Church in France over the schools and other institutions for several centuries. A major goal of state schools in France is to ensure that youth obtain a secular education. Muslim students in French state schools, for example, are prevented from wearing the hijab and other religious symbols. And this has been a very contentious issue in France. And France has not dealt with the diversity, particularly of Muslim students, well at all. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A period. But they've not dealt well with the Muslim students at all. What about schools as a factor? And how can schools be a factor in reducing failed citizenship? They can be a factor in reducing it. But what schools have historically done is contributed to failed citizenship. How have they done that? They have denied the culture, the languages, and the religion of stigmatized and marginalized groups. And I'm going to give some examples from the United States and Canada. Joel Spring, S-P-R-I-N-G, in a book called Deculturalization. Please write that term down. It's not on the overhead, but it's in my notes. Joel Springs talks about deculturalization, how schools and their attempt to eliminate the culture and languages of students and to help them develop a national identity as if they were inconsistent. Schools made the assumption that if you're Palestinian or black or Mexican American, you can't be a good nationalist and carry your own culture and language. That's a fallacy. Research indicates that you can be a better citizen of Israel, or a better citizen of the United States, or a better citizen of Canada if you have your own culture and your own language. You cannot, it's not an inconsistency. You can actually be a better citizen. But what have schools done? Historically, have tried to eradicate kids' cultures from marginalized groups and to give them the so-called mainstream white culture. For example, Angela Valenzuela, in a book, please write it down, called Subtractive Schooling, Angela Valenzuela talks about how schools in the United States eradicated the culture of Mexican American students, especially their language. And she calls that subtractive schooling. That's the name of her book. But William Greenbaum said we did the same thing to Jewish students and Polish students at the turn of the century. William Greenbaum, in a famous article in the Harvard Educational Review, said we told Jews and we told Polish folks in the United States, get rid of Hebrew, get rid of Yiddish. He called it hope and shame. We taught the Jews that if you give up your language, so that's shame. They shamed, Greenbaum said we shamed Jewish students of their language, but we taught them what? Hope. That if you give up Yiddish, if you give up Hebrew and fit in and learn English, we will give you hope. But we shamed their culture. So it's an old story. Greenbaum said it didn't start with blacks, it didn't start with Mexican Americans, but it goes back to the Jewish immigrants at the turn of the century, and to the Polish immigrants at the turn of the century. Also, let me talk about American Indians in both the United States and Canada. In both the United States and Canada, to get rid of the culture of Indian students, we sent them to boarding schools, cut them off from their families, took them away from their families. To quote Captain Richard Pratt, who was the head of one of these boarding schools, this is the famous quote. He said, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Again, Pratt said, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." That was the kind of a simulationism that schools undertook to eradicate the culture of students. And I'm watching the time, and I think I'm doing okay. Let me move on to how the school then, what the school has done, and talk about a different role for schools. What should be the role of schools in reducing failed citizenship? An important goal of civic education should be to help students from marginalized groups attain a sense of structural inclusion and integration within their nation states and a clarified national identities. Keep in mind, and I'll come to this later, that cultural identities are consistent with national identity, not opposed. Research indicates that the content and methods of school-based, civic, and multicultural education programs can promote structural inclusion, recognition, social justice, and consequently reduce failed citizenship. What should be the role of transformative civic education? It should be to reduce failed citizenship and help students develop a delicate balance, note delicate balance, of cultural, regional, national, and global identifications. By the way, these identifications, as the next slide will show, are interactive, contextual, and complex. This shows how cultural identification should be held and respected and legitimized as we help kids to develop a thoughtful national identity. But that is not sufficient. We should also help students to develop a global identity, a cosmopolitanism, as Nussbaum and Appia calls it. And of course, in Europe, we need to help students develop a regional identification, or in the Americas, to develop a regional identification. These identities are complex, interactive, and fluid. And I have a personal example of how identity is being fluid. When I am in the United States, by the way, my primary and first identity is a black American, man. When I arrived at Heathrow Airport to give a lecture at the University of London in 2016, what do you think my first identity became as I landed in Heathrow? What do you think? Exactly, American. You shift the focus. You begin to feel very, and even in London, I become defensive of America. I'm not very defensive of America in Seattle, but I am when I get to London. So identity is complex. Please note in your notes, identity is complex, contextual, fluid, situational, and contextual. And I think this is what we as teachers have to remember. We don't have to eradicate the Palestinian identity of kids for them to become good Israelis. That we can become, that identity is complex and contextual. What about mainstream civic education? Mainstream civic education is grounded in mainstream knowledge and assumptions and assimilation is the ideology. It's the kind of assimilation I talked about, of how we eradicate and put Indians in boarding schools in both Canada and the U.S. I didn't have time to talk much about that, but there have been new studies that indicated that many Indian kids were not only abused in these boarding schools in Canada and the U.S., but many of them actually lost their lives. The mainstream civic education reinforces the status quo and the dominant powers relationships in society. It does not challenge or disrupt the class, racial, and gender discrimination within schools and society. Transformative civic education is rooted in transformative academic knowledge. It enables students to acquire the knowledge, skills, and values needed to challenge inequality within their communities, their nation, and the world, and to take action to create just and democratic multicultural communities and societies. Transformative education teaches students to know, to care, and to act. Knowing, caring, and acting. That's what Rosa Parks did. Her family had been in the civil rights movement. She knew, she didn't give up her seat. She was asked to give up her seat to a white man. She said, today I'm not doing it. I'm going to act. I'm going to care, and I'm going to act. And her action was very influential. To know, to care, and to act. We also need to teach kids to care. To care. In addition to teaching helping students to attain knowledge, we also need to teach them to care. Horace Mann, in his commencement address at NAL College in 1859, told the graduates to be ashamed to die until you won some victory for humankind. Margaret Mead said that a handful of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that has. We also need to teach students to act. Dante said that the worst place in hell is reserved for those who in times of a great moral crisis take a neutral stand. Rosa Parks was not neutral. Gandhi was not neutral. And neither was Martin Luther King. Edwin Burke said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. And Marian Wright Edelman, shown at the left side of the photograph, Marian Wright Edelman said, "The service is the rent we pay for living. It is the very purpose of life, and not something you do in your spare time." Audre Lorde in the center, who worked hard for the rights of LGBTQ people, said that your silence will not protect you. You just can't be silent. I'm not going to take a stand. Neutrality will not protect you. Your silence will not protect you. And Gloria Steinem on the right side said, "The root of oppression is the lost amendment." We must remember, the root of oppression is the lost amendment. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life exemplified knowing, caring, and acting. He was a transformative leader. King, and by the way, near the end of his life, was being highly criticized for opposing the Vietnam War. From blacks and whites, by the way, he was being highly criticized. We may remember King as a great hero today, but he caught a lot of flack for opposing the Vietnam War. And in his famous speech, I believe this was a speech at Riverside Church, King said, "It is my deep conviction that justice is indivisible, that justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. For those who tell me I'm hurting the civil rights movement and ask, don't you think that in order to be respected and in order to gain support, you must stop talking against the war?" I can only say that I'm not a consensus leader. I do not seek to determine what is right and wrong by taking a Gallup poll to determine majority opinion. And it is again my deep conviction that ultimately a genuine leader is not a searcher of consensus, but a molder of consensus. On some position, the coward asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience must ask the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular. But one must take it because it is right. And that is where I find myself today. King also said that we will live together as brothers and sisters, or die separate and apart as strangers. And to conclude, I will conclude from my favorite writer, James Baldwin. James Baldwin, in an extemporaneous speech to public schools teachers in New York City, Baldwin stated, by the way, look it up on the internet, it's called A Talk to Teachers. It's one of my favorite documents, and I always use it in my classes. In this Talk to Teachers, Baldwin described the kind of citizens we need to educate and the dire consequences of not doing so. He said that the purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself that this is black or this is white, to decide for himself whether there's a God in heaven or not, to ask questions of the universe, and then to live with those questions, is the way he achieved his identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of citizen around. What society really ideally wants is a citizenry that will simply obey the rules of society. If a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. Thank you. And the last slide is my latest book, which contains a summary of the ideas in this lecture. We have time. I think I'm scheduled to 10:30. We have time for some questions, could we, please? And we can maybe have the lights back for the questions. Are there microphones, or you can just use your 5th grade teaching voice?
Riyadh, I have a comment, not a question. Okay?
Yes.
So what I wanted to say that
We have comments and questions.
Hello.
Both go.
thank you for the very fruitful lecturer. I enjoyed all, and it's very close to the study that I'm going to present today. What I wanted to say that a language is very successful tool that the majority use it to control over the minorities. And we know it all over the world. So you have, as a minority, to know the language of the majority so you can have the opportunity to live as a citizen normally. But if you don't control the language of the majority, you should live in a very big problem. So this is what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, language and linguistic racism and pluralism has been one of the major ways of keeping people oppressed. That's why the Indians in the boarding school were stripped of their language. That's why Mexican Americans in schools that Angel Valencia talks about, subtractive schooling, the language of the Mexican American was eradicated. It was a way of stripping them of power and of self-concept. Other questions or comments? I appreciate both. Yes.
First of all, an invitation. I'm in the process of setting up a Navon Center for a Shared Society. When we open up, you're going to come and give the keynote address at the opening.
And
so plan your next trip to Israel.
And I won't miss my flight in San Francisco.
Okay. In the meantime, though, a question. I think what we're suffering from in Israel is not deculturation, but cultural hegemony. We are in a situation where throughout our society we have parallel school systems. Within the so-called Jewish school system, we have secular, traditional, Orthodox, and ultra-Orthodox, where the kids don't mix. In the Arab sector, unfortunately, I don't know enough about the Arab sector, but most of the Arab students are in schools without Jewish children. And rather than getting the kind of transformative education that you're suggesting, I think people are really in a situation where they're only learning about their own culture. Thoughts of yours on the differences or the advantages, disadvantages of separate systems where people are indeed getting their culture, and mixed school systems where people are perhaps in danger of losing their culture.
Exactly. I just want to say amen, as we do in the black church. Amen.
Well, I have one question. Do you think that President Obama contribute for the black population in the United States? It means that under his regime or under his administration, do you think that this administration gave the black population in the United States a kind of equal citizenship, equal rights. Do you think that he gave this population something that, well, that it was not happening before him, or he exactly became the same as other American presidents, that there is deep state in the country and this deep state continue to rule even in the United States, even you are a black president, even you are the president of the United States. Because I think you spoke very important things. I can say for you that always I make my speeches about Martin Luther King, because I think he had the best dream how to build the personal citizen and the personal human being. Therefore, it's very important. But the period of Obama, I think, was not so to the benefit of the black in the United States.
Can everybody hear the question? Because this is an important one. It's a complex issue. In effect, I think I'm translating your question. Did Obama make a difference in terms of black progress and ideology? It's a complex response. My response is complex, and Sherry might want to respond. Put her on the spot before tomorrow. It's complicated. The answer is yes and no. Electing Obama was very, very important symbolically for young black boys and girls, and for this black professor. Seeing a black man in the White House was very important symbolically. As a matter of fact, we gave a big donation and shook his hand, for example. But keep in mind that as hard as Obama tried, and he did, we now have medical care. We didn't have it before Obama. Keep in mind that he was dealing with a social structure of racism and hegemony that has been established for 300 years. One person in 8 years can only do so much to crack the system. And he did a lot symbolically. He did some things that were beyond symbolic. But one person can't transform a racist system in a deep structure within 8 years. So the answer is yes and no, that he did a lot, but it was not enough. But you can't change a structure of racism that's been established for 300 years. One person in 8 years can't overturn it or transform it. So the answer is yes and no. He was terribly significant, terribly important, but we still have roads ahead of us. Yes.
Hi.
What you want to say?
Hi, I'm Hannah Saliba Salman. I have a question about parallel nationalities, whether this is a threat to your suggested transformative citizenship.
What is the threat?
Parallel nationalities, the way we live today in Israel as Arabic Jews.
Yeah, it's certainly, I grew up in the system you're in, except it was worse, I think. I grew up in apartheid in Arkansas, where we had to enter the back door in the theater. This was so silly. The dentist's office, the dentist was in the middle, here was the black room, here was the white room, and of course we sat in the same chair. So that's the system that I grew up in. I would argue that an apartheid system is a barrier to transformative nation, transformative citizenship, because people have to know each other. I grew up not realizing that a lot of things that they told me about white folks were nothing but myths. We didn't know what real whites were like. We thought they were ideally, and for example, that was whitewater and colored water. And one day we black kids decided to taste whitewater. We were so disappointed. It tasted no different than black water, white colored water. We said this is a myth. The whole thing is a myth. It's a fiction. I think you have to bring folks together in order to create a transformative nation, in order for people to understand and to know each other. Otherwise, they grow up with fiction and myths about each other. So I think an apartheid system is not an effective way to create a nation state, if that's what you're asking.
I'm asking because we rarely have mixed schools, and if education is the key, so I don't know where we go from here.
Yeah, I wouldn't get rid of religious schools. I would just make sure that people had equal opportunity to attend them. You know. Other questions? We have time for 2 more. Yeah.
I am a retired teacher from STM. Okay, my name is Elham Farah. Originally, I'm from Nazareth. I have education from Hebrew University. I have been living with my husband and family over 40 years in Ontario. I'm a retired teacher, and my master in education at Brock University, teaching and learning citizenship education in Ontario. So, well, thank you for touching on many, many things with regard to citizenship education. My question, what's the role of the family and how the family would affect relationship with the schools in reducing failed citizenship?
Yeah, I think the role of the family is important, but I think it's important to keep the family informed. But I think the family need to also understand what are the transformative values that the school stands for. For example, suppose that the family is against gay marriage. The school has to transform to the family that they're committed to all groups, whether they're sexual minorities, whether they're racial minorities, that there's an overarching set of values that the public school must stand for. Social justice, equality. And so if the family says, I'm not for gay rights, then the school cannot agree with that. In other words, there's a set of democratic and humane values that goes above unique family values that we have to stand for and that we can't compromise. That we have to stand for social justice, social equality for all groups and all societies. So yes, listen to the family, invite the family, to help the family understand what our values are. And our values are for social justice, social equality, no matter what the family stands for. We have time for one more question, I believe.
Okay. Only one question, because we have the break, and I have to thank Professor Banks.
Okay, thank you, Professor Banks. I'm from Italy, and I'm especially focusing on the Italy situation. So I don't know if you know, but the migrant situation in Italy is not very good because, especially in schools, we have dropout, low performances, and so on. So we are fighting against this kind of situation. But one of the main reason I found inside the school, not as a society, as a system, is that teachers has a lot of unconscious bias against migrant pupils because of their diversity, okay? And I always struggle against this kind of situation. It's not easy, and I wanted to ask you if you have something to suggest us to do, because I know that it's very difficult to fight against a system, but also against a cultural, yes, that's it. That's
I'll give a brief answer because we're limited in time. A very important question, and I think Cherry Banks is going to talk about teacher education tomorrow, I believe. But I think one of the things that we need to help teachers do is deal with what our friend at Stanford University, Jennifer Eberhard, calls implicit bias. Write that name down, Jennifer Eberhard, implicit bias. We have to help teachers deal with their implicit bias that they haven't thought about. Help them become conscious of it. Help them aware of it. And help them talk about what I did in my Methods course for teachers. I had them do a biography of their cultural journey. And it was very enlightening to teachers. Many of my teachers, most of whom were white women, hadn't thought about the racism that they had experienced till they did these cultural biographies. Thank you very much, and I'll be around to do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we got a good time and very constructive lesson what the lecture of Professor Banks, and I want to thank him in behalf of all the audience. It was very strength and strong lecture, but I want to say for you that sometimes minorities like to be as a sectarial groups, and they dislike to be involved in everything. Because if you always think that the majority, they are the ruling, and you as minority, you have not the advantage to do something for yourself, you will continue to be in a certain surrounding, you will not live in the white surrounding because you are black. Even they reject you, you have to do your best in order to be. And I want to tell you something. I'm from a village, it's not far from Haifa. And in that time, it was no secondary school in Dalat al-Kamel, and I chose to learn in Hebrew secondary school. You know why? Because I want to know the other people, I want to learn their history, I want to learn their language, I want to speak with them in their language, in their mind, and I have the chance also to know how I speak with them. Because if I feel that they up of me and I am under, we will not be equal in any field. We have to look in their eyes. We are strong. We know. We study. We intellectual. This is the reason that we have a struggle in this country, because we want, I learned also in the Hebrew University, and I think this is the reasons why I look for the education, the main how you can build a human being without even prejudice for this or that. We know that there's discrimination between majority and minorities. We know even beyond the majorities there are discriminations between all kinds of communities, especially in Israel. You know, we know there is Ashkenaz in the Jews, we know there is Haredim in the Jews, we know there is Sfaradim in the Jews, we know also among the Arab. You spoke about the Muslims in France. They don't want to learn in France. They want to continue to be in sector. They want to be in surrounding. Why they are not involved? Why they don't know what's integration? It's very important. Thank you very much. But because Professor Randa asked me to, we have to make a special picture. Therefore, I ask all of you in the first class here to be with Professor Banks and Professor Banks, also Cherry Banks, and all of you to have a special picture together. And thank you very much, Professor Banks.